In this episode, we talk about the rising threat of antimicrobial resistance and the common misconceptions about antibiotics. We also talk about Vinesh Phogat's transformation into a politician and her ongoing campaign in Haryana. But first, we talk about the radio and pager attacks that were carried out in Lebanon and Syria last week. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Tensions in West Asia escalated last week following 2 days of coordinated attacks across Lebanon and parts of Syria. During the attacks, pagers and handheld radios, many of them used by Hezbollah, exploded, resulting in at least 37 deaths and over 3,500 injuries. Hezbollah, the Lebanese political party and militant group, has accused Israel of carrying out the attacks, though Israel has neither confirmed nor denied responsibility. In a speech delivered on Thursday evening, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said that the attacks were a terrorist act and a declaration of war against Lebanon and its people. To discuss the implications of this for the region and the concerns for India, we spoke to Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy. And he began by telling us the long-standing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, which is known to be funded and supported by Iran.
And for Israel, Hezbollah is seen as a formidable adversary in its northern borders. So northern Israel and southern Lebanon, they share the border. And that's where the two sides have been facing off. Especially it intensified after the war in Gaza started after the October 7th terror attacks by Hamas last year. And as you know, that Hamas managed to sort of kill about 1,200 people in Israel, many of them women, children, and civilians, and some security personnel, military personnel from Israel as well, and took 250 hostages.
And so once Israel got tangled in the war in Gaza and began initiating a series of attacks in the region, Shubhajit says Hezbollah opened up a front in the north.
So it has been an intense but a low-key conflict playing out in the north while Israel was concentrating on the war in Gaza in the south. So now, after about 11 months of pulverizing Gaza after aerial strikes, Israel is now shifting its focus towards north and taking on Hezbollah. And the recent attempt to kill or injure about 3,000 people who were part of the Hezbollah group is an attempt or is an effort towards that shifting focus, where it is now making Hezbollah its primary enemy because it feels that Israel has been able to decimate Hamas substantially.
Now, during these coordinated attacks, as we mentioned before, pagers exploded across Lebanon. These pagers, essentially one-way communication devices, were used by the top brass of Hezbollah. And just a day before this attack took place, we heard a statement from the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant.
And he essentially said that, now we need to move the focus towards the north. And that was the first sign where there was a signal that northern borders will become hot once again. So just to quote Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, the only way left to ensure the return of Israel's northern communities to their homes will be via military action. So that was sort of an indicator that Israel was going to mount military action. And in fact, just hours before these coordinated attacks, a statement from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office strongly suggested the possibility of expanding military operations to get Hezbollah to stop firing at Israeli targets.
In fact, he says that once the war in Gaza began, Israel's security cabinet set two primary goals: the destruction of Hamas and the return of the 250 hostages. But just hours before the attacks in Lebanon, the security cabinet updated its objectives, adding the safe return of displaced Israelis to its official war goals.
So these were clear signs that Israel was going to mount an offensive to the north and towards taking the fight to Hezbollah directly. And it was obviously not known which way how they will do it. But these were clear evidences, clear signs that Israel was planning a military offensive or a coordinated attack or operations in southern Lebanon and targeting Hezbollah.
Meanwhile, he says having pulverized large parts of Gaza, Israel believes that it has substantially degraded the capabilities of Hamas in the region.
But with Hezbollah, which is a much more powerful adversary in the north, the scale and magnitude and the methodology will become very different. Now, Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, he has vowed a just punishment for the attacks. And there is a serious risk of dramatic escalation in Lebanon. But Iran, which is the main benefactor of Hezbollah, is seen as a very smart and pragmatic rival. It will want to avenge the humiliation, but my sense is they will not rush to do so in a sort of fit of rage. So there are possibilities that there could be a repeat of the attack like it happened in April when Iran had launched a wave of aerial attacks on targets in Israel, which were intercepted and had limited impact. Tehran could also coordinate with partners in the axis of resistance, but Hamas is decimated through Hezbollah and Houthis to carry out attacks on Israel. Or it could target Israeli officials in third countries, perhaps after waiting for some time. So we have to see how Hezbollah responds to the situation and Iran responds to it. Iran is really the brain behind Hezbollah.
And Israel, for its part, could of course retaliate further and continue its offensive against the militant group. And we'll have to wait and see how things unfold in the coming days. But the other thing to note is that Israel has been facing backlash from a number of countries around the world due to the scale of its attacks in Gaza, which have resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians, including children. And these latest attacks in Lebanon could intensify this pushback, especially given that booby traps are forbidden under international law. However, Shubhajit says that Israel could justify these actions by claiming that the pagers, for example, were used to mount terror attacks against the country.
So my sense is that it's complicated that people who are backers of Iran and backers of, say, Hezbollah would give this justification that, yes, you cannot target civilians because there are a couple of children also who have been killed, I saw. But Israel's justification will be, and which it has made in Gaza, that any establishment, a school or a hospital, when it is being used by terrorists, then they lose the immunity. That is the fundamental position that they have outlined in the last 11 months.
Now, these attacks also pose a challenge for New Delhi, which has so far walked a tight diplomatic rope.
During the 11-month ongoing war in Gaza, it has abstained from most of the UN resolutions. It has always asked for ceasefire. It has made statements against terrorism. It has also asked for release of the hostages, but continuing to advocate for humanitarian aid and also asking Israel to abide by the international humanitarian law. So it has tried to make that balancing act. But when it comes to Hezbollah, Iran is much more directly linked there. And if there is an escalation between Israel and Hezbollah, Iran is definitely would be drawn into the conflict. And if there is the sort of conflict between Israel and Iran through Hezbollah, then, Western partners won't be able to ignore Israel's lack of security or their right to self-defense. So US and other European partners may also join the conflict. So that is the most dangerous situation, an escalation that India definitely wouldn't want to see.
This is considering the fact that some 9 million Indians live and work in the region, and about 2/3 of India's crude oil and natural gas comes from West Asia.
And any conflict would lead to an impact on crude prices and supply, could impact the country's energy security. We already saw the stress on the supply chains when Houthis started attacking merchant ships which were passing through the Red Sea. So that had put a strain on India's supply chain as well. So these have been the real concerns. So India has sort of so far made no statements over the last couple of days on the volatile situation in the region. But in the past, we had seen in April, especially after the Iranian attack on Israel, India had expressed serious concern at the escalation of hostilities and had called for immediate de-escalation. And External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar had back then spoken to both Iranian foreign minister as well as the Israeli foreign minister at the time. Now, Delhi will obviously would want to keep its channels of communication open and would hope that this possible new situation of war can be averted.
And next we talk about antibiotics, specifically the alarming threat of what is called antimicrobial resistance, or AMR.
So, antimicrobial resistance is essentially the ability that microbes gain over time to proliferate even in the presence of medicines that should ideally work to stop their replication.
That's Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, who reports on health for the paper.
So basically, medicines that are effective against those infections stop working. It usually happens because of overuse of antibiotics or misuse of antibiotics, which basically leads to the microbes, getting the ability to stay alive and survive even with these drugs.
Now, this is concerning because it means that even simple infections could potentially become life-threatening. And this is the reason why the World Health Organization earlier this month published its first ever guidance on the antibiotic pollution from drug manufacturing and stated that the emergence and rise of AMR could undermine the effectiveness of antibiotics globally. To tell us more about this issue, my colleague Ichha Sharma speaks to Anonna in this segment.
So, Anonna, we understand that this AMR is a serious threat. So, can you tell us how it actually affects our body?
So essentially with AMR, what happens is commonly used drugs. So if you have, say, fever or diarrhea or some other kind of infection, the commonly used drugs stop working. So even if you have those medicines, you continue to be unwell. But on the larger front, if somebody is hospitalized with some kind of infection and these antimicrobials do not work, that means they will have to be treated with higher antibiotics, which lead to much more side effects. They will have to stay in hospitals longer. And this is a problem with, any kind of surgery or other, hospitalizations related to other ailments. And people end up getting these superbugs, which are very, very difficult to treat. So that is the problem with growing AMR. More and more infections become resistant to antibiotics and it gets more and more difficult to treat them.
Right. And when issuing new guidelines, WHO also used the term antibiotic pollution. Can you tell us what that is and how does it actually relate to AMR?
So antibiotic in any form, whether you pop it when you have some kind of infection or whether it is present in the environment. So one of the most common source of antibiotic in the environment is from poultry. A lot of poultry farms would give antibiotic injections to the chickens so that they remain healthy. But eating that also contributes towards antimicrobial resistance. And this is more common, say, in the US, where they would have like these large farms with a lot of chickens living in close proximity. A lot of antibiotics are used there because in that close proximity, they want to prevent infections. And then comes the third thing that was highlighted by a recent WHO report where they were talking about manufacture of these antibiotics and how, effluents from these manufacturing sites can also lead to increased antimicrobial resistance and what needs to be done.
So, what are the main reasons that experts are saying this is happening?
So there are a few things that contribute towards antimicrobial resistance. First of all, it is people like us. A lot of people are in the habit of popping pills instead of going to a doctor. And an antibiotic does not do anything if it's a viral infection. So the flu that happens during the season change or dengue, these kind of infections cannot be treated with an antimicrobial because they are viral infections and viral infections do not respond to antibiotics. So not only are you not treating the infection, you are also adding antibiotics to your body, which will again lead to more resistance. So that is one thing. You should always consult a doctor when you have any fever, diarrhea, anything. They would be able to give you the appropriate antibiotic for the infection. Secondly, it comes to the doctors themselves. So a lot of the prescription of antibiotics that happens, it happens empirically. So what that means is the doctor would see your symptoms, and based on that, they would decide what is likely to be the cause of the infection. So for example, if you have fever, joint ache behind the eye, patches on your skin, during the monsoon season, the most likely suspect is dengue, and they would treat the infection accordingly. But for most cases, they don't essentially test for the infection. They treat you by educatedly guessing which infection is likely. So experts say there is more and more need to have point of care tests so that doctors can immediately test the patient and see which infection it is and give antibiotics accordingly.
So, Anonna, can we say that doctors are mainly doing that to save the patient's money?
So there are two considerations that doctors make when they do this empirical prescription. One is, of course, saving the patient's money because tests are expensive. And when you're pretty sure that it's, say, dengue or malaria, you do not want to, say, do it and charge the patient $500,000 more. But the second consideration is also for people who come in quite sick. So if you're doing a bacterial culture, that would take somewhere about 3 days for the report to come back, and you cannot afford to not give them any medicine for those 3 days. So doctors in such cases would ideally prescribe, broad spectrum antibiotics. And then once the culture results come back, they will scale it down to the specific antibiotic meant for that infection. And broad spectrum antibiotics are essentially those that can work against several different microbes. But these are also the ones that lead to the most of the bacteria or pathogens developing resistance as well.
So in light of this, could you also talk about the common misconceptions that people have about taking antibiotics?
So if we are talking about common people, one is, of course, just, have an antibiotic and you'll be okay the next day. That is not how it works. Antimicrobials have to be consumed in a proper dosage and the entire course has to be completed. So a course would be, say, for 3 days or 5 days as per your doctor's prescription. But people need to complete their treatment, because if they do not, then yes, they might feel better for a couple of days, but that infection still stays in their body, develops resistance, and then causes more severe infections. So people should definitely, if they start antibiotics, they should complete it. They should not share their prescriptions. It's not that if I am prescribed an antibiotic, my mother would also need the same one. That should not be done. Everybody should visit a doctor when they have an infection and only take the antibiotics that they have been prescribed and for the prescribed duration, not just for a couple of days.
Also, we know, of course, that antibiotics are crucial in treating infections, but are there good alternatives to it that experts suggest people can consume?
So antibiotics have changed healthcare completely. It's around, say, the first antibiotic was discovered, say, around 100 years ago. And since then, less and less people are dying of infections. Infections used to be the largest killer for the longest time. It is now that, say, heart diseases and cancers are taking over because infections have become treatable. But if we lose antibiotics, that is likely to change. And of course, people are looking at different ways to treat infections. One of them is called phages, which are essentially other pathogens that can, eat up those, the potentially dangerous bacteria. So those are things that are being attempted, but essentially we have to ensure that we conserve the existing antimicrobials and also invest in developing more.
Okay, so you mentioned the things that people can do to avoid getting AMR. But can you talk a bit about what health officials should do on their end?
So again, they have to ensure that they do not overprescribe it. They do not prescribe it for people who do not need it. So for example, people who have a viral infection, they shouldn't be given antibiotics just to prevent something that might happen later on, because that is not how antibiotics work. Secondly, it should not be given to people who are undergoing simple procedures, maybe a keyhole surgery or say a dental procedure where, there's not existing infection involved. So in those cases, you do not need antibiotics necessarily, and it should not be given. So there has to be protocols which have to be specific to every hospital per se, where they have guidelines on which antibiotics to be given when. Then experts also suggest reducing antibiotic prescription itself. So what happens, there was a national survey that was done by the National Center of Disease Control, which found an unusually high amount of antibiotics being prescribed, like almost 3/4 of the people walking into a tertiary care hospital getting antibiotics. And most of them were not for an infection, it was to prevent an infection. So doctors routinely prescribe antibiotics, say before a surgery, before a procedure, in the hopes of preventing an infection later on. But this is not necessary, first of all. And secondly, the experts say that it should be given only in something called the dirty surgeries. These are surgeries essentially where you would be dealing with, say, fecal matter and stuff, where there is a likelihood of, or some procedure which is on the outside of the body where, again, the exposed wound could lead to a possible infection. They say antibiotics should be given only in those cases. It should also not be given in cases where people have a viral infection, but it is routinely prescribed to prevent what is called a secondary infection. But again, that is something which guidelines say should not be done.
And in the end, we talk about the Olympic wrestler Vinesh Phogat, who joined the Congress party earlier this month and is now contesting in the upcoming Haryana elections from the Julana constituency. Her decision to enter politics came shortly after her return from the Paris Olympics, where she was disqualified from the 50 kg gold medal bout for being just 100 grams overweight. Phogat, who was also one of the leading figures in the protests against BJP MP and former Wrestling Federation President Brij Bhushan Sharan Singh, who has been accused of sexually harassing multiple female wrestlers, is now actively campaigning across villages in Julana with only days left before the crucial state elections. Indian Express's Nihal Koshie spent a day with her on the campaign trail and says that her transition from wrestler to politician has been fairly smooth.
So quite a surprise, but also not a surprise looking at the way she led the protests. Because I'm sure the fact that she led the protests for 2 months and after the protests were called off, they were forced to call off the protests also, there was this battle. So she had to deal with so many people on her side, people against her, ministers, government officials. So I think that has helped. And her speeches are appealing to her vote bank, which I would say is largely the women and young girls who look up to her. She's campaigning, talking about give vote for your Beti and Bahu. And also for someone who fought for your rights, who fought for women's rights, to ensure that sport and in general sport is safe for women. And that is surely striking a chord because there is a good turnout of women. And you can see that real love for her.
आज का निशान है ताई अरे वो आज का निशान है थप्पड़ का काम करेगा 5 तारीख में बढ़िया जाता है तो बाद दिल्ली दिन लगेगा जाके अभी टाइम आ गया है बदला लेने का बदला लेना है बेरोजगारी का बदला लेना आपके अपमान का.
It could be also because there are many factors. One, her husband Somveer, who's a Greco-Roman wrestler who stood by her. Julana is his hometown. Then there's the fact that she's just come back from the Paris Olympics where there was that heartbreaking disqualification. So the general sentiment is that she deserves the medal and she's a winner, but there was a conspiracy which led to her not winning the medal. So she's greeted with that like a champion. What happened at a couple of villages is as they wait for Vinesh, the weighing scale comes out. Okay. And then what they do is that when Vinesh comes, she's first pagadis are put on her, flowers are showered on her, and then she's made to stand on the weighing scale. And then whatever her weight is, 5 kilos more of laddus is put. Like suppose her weight was 55, so then 60 kilos of laddus is put and it's distributed. So basically, what the one Sarpanch told us there is that we are not like people in Paris. Your weight doesn't matter. And then also the third fact that she's a woman who's like from Haryana. I mean, there are a lot of wrestlers, women wrestlers who come out of Haryana, that is there. But just to reach the height she's reached. So even young girls, like there was one girl who came and told her like, Didi, aapki jeet pakki hai, guarantee hai. She took an autograph, just one person. There are old women coming out, women just standing and waving to her. You can see the joy.
During their conversation, Nihal asked her the reason why she chose to join politics. And she said that she now realizes how much power politicians hold and wants to use that influence to bring about change.
I think she realized the harsh reality of where she was when she was at the protest site. She was constantly battling a force which was so powerful, basically the government. So she also says that, see, now if someone like me, Bajrans or Sakshi have power with us, then she feels that if something goes wrong with young athletes, if something bad happens to them, women athletes, they will be in a position to do something to help them. If Vinesh is a MLA, or if Vinesh is, say, for example, the general talk is that she could be the sports minister. If she is that, then she has some sort of power. We can't deny that politicians are powerful. They have so much of perks. They have so much of following. And if a politician speaks up, of course, it carries a lot of weight. And somebody like Vinesh talking with this background of the protest. So she feels that if something goes wrong and if people know that she's a MLA, she's with the Congress government, which is in power in Haryana, if the Congress wins, and then, she's a minister, they will call her and tell her and she can do something about it. And one interesting thing she said was like, so when we asked her that what made you switch to politics, like she gave an interesting story saying that during the qualification period, she suddenly started, she likes to shop, like she likes to buy shoes, cream, all that. So she started buying suits. It was an obsession for about a month and a half. She bought about 80 suits, but now she knows why. She says it's just destiny because she wears suits for campaigning.
This was a short preview from the latest episode of the Indian Express's sports podcast. For a deeper dive into Vinesh Phogat's transition into politics, click the link in the show notes to listen to the full episode. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Ichha Sharma and me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.